Brian Albert Jr. took the stand. He's 25 years old and lives with his parents. He was also dressed almost exactly the same as his father was. He works in IT. Oh, really? So if Brian Albert, the detective, is so ignorant of how phone data works, surely his son knows. You think he wouldn't ask? If he didn't know, never mind, he already knew. On January 28th, Brian Jr. had friends over, starting at around 7:30 p.m., and he named the friends. When the friends first arrived, Mom was still at home. Julie Albert came and picked up Nicole Albert. More of Brian Jr.'s friends showed up at around 8. They had drinks and food. And when he named the friends who were there at 8 p.m., Colin Albert's name was not mentioned. He said they were mostly in the dining room and kitchen. He said he assumes his friends got dropped off. He said Colin arrived at some point, but he can't pinpoint when. He said then later his parents and them came back, and he said something interesting. He mentioned he didn't know how it was that Colin knew he was even home. Colin had called and asked if he could come by. And now Brian Jr. is saying he thinks that was about 10:45 or 11 o'clock. So again, this is showing that this visit from Colin was not planned the way Julie Albert and Chris Albert would like you to believe. And you know, for the case of John O'Keefe and Karen Reed and the events that took place later, the question of whether or not Julie and Chris knew that he was going there or whether or not it was planned appears on the surface to not be an important detail, to not be a thing to lie about. So if there's not something up with this in this case, there's something up with this either in general or related to something else. Brian Jr. said some of his friends left at around 11. His parents came home shortly after midnight. He says he doesn't know how Colin got to Fairview. He said he didn't recall meeting Brian Higgins previous to this. Brian Jr. said Colin was leaving as his parents were coming in and that Allie McCabe was picking up Colin. But here's the problem. This is just stuff that he was told. He said everyone was in the kitchen and dining room. Jen and Matt McCabe arrived, and by the time they arrived, Colin had left. Allie is Jen McCabe's daughter. He says Caitlin was the last to leave. No one else came by. He said at one point he looked out the window and saw a vehicle out front. He said his friend Julie's brother was there to pick her up. So he looked out the window and saw another vehicle there. And he said he could see this from the kitchen. And I think this is an important little detail because all along they're saying they're all in the kitchen, dining room, family room area. So if there was an accident out front or tail lights or headlights facing in a weird direction or facing toward the windows of the house, somebody would have noticed, yeah? He said in front of Julie's brother's vehicle, he saw a dark SUV. And that SUV was in front of the mailbox. He noticed later that the SUV had moved. So it was closer to the other end of the property toward the flagpole. He said he didn't hear any noises. He said he looked out twice. He said he saw Julie out there. He said Julie was out there 3 or 4 minutes. He didn't say whether the lights inside the SUV were on or not, or whether the vehicle was idling or what. He said then Julie came back inside. He said he wasn't downstairs at the time when Caitlin left. So how does he know when she left? How can he say when Caitlin left if he wasn't there when that occurred? Could it be somebody maybe told him what time she left? He said his bedroom is upstairs in the middle back of the house. He said he didn't hear anything. He said on the 29th, he woke up at 7:30 a.m. by his father, Brian Albert, knocking on his bedroom door. He said he went downstairs, and when he got downstairs, his mother, father, Jen and Matt McCabe were there. He said he stayed down there for about 15 minutes, then went back up to his room. He said he came back down like an hour and a half later, and everyone was gone. He said he didn't see Julie Albert, but he knew she must have been there because she had left donuts for him. He said that during the festivities of the night before, the mood was cheerful. There were no fights. He said Chloe was upstairs and that when Dad came home, Dad let the dog out. And I note, the prosecution hadn't asked if Chloe was downstairs or not. So this was volunteered information. And every time a witness volunteers extra information, my ears perk up. He was questioned again about the SUV. The SUV was first near the mailbox, and a couple of minutes later, the SUV was near the flag. And he's not saying whether it's moving or whether it was parked. He was asked whether he noticed any injuries on his father, and he said no. He said he knew of John O'Keefe but didn't know him personally, and he had never met Karen Reed. For the defense, Miss Little did the cross. Turns out, the first time that Brian Jr. ever spoke to the police about this incident was July of 2023. That's 18 months later. And when he did speak with the police, he spoke with 2 troopers and his own lawyer, and that interview was conducted at his attorney's office. The defense went after how he and his cousins communicate on Snapchat, and really my impression of the whole exchange was that Brian Jr. was telling the truth about not having planned for Colin to come over, that this was something Colin wanted to do. And he repeated, I don't know how he knew I was home, and Snapchat came up because he said maybe he saw something on Snapchat and figured out I was home. So that was, from his perspective, why he would bring that up. And the defense was asking about Snapchat messages, and apparently they have like group chats with the cousins. The defense asked him, do you still have messages between you and your cousins from January 28th? And he answered, I don't even know if there were messages. He said at midnight they were in the dining room area. He said he never actually saw Colin leave. The defense asked what time Chloe came down or went out. And Brian Jr. said, well, as soon as the parents got home, the dad went up and got the dog. He said Colin was gone by the time Dad went up to get Chloe. The defense asked him about seeing this SUV outside. He said there was nothing obstructing his view to the truck and the SUV, so he could clearly see it. And he even saw tire marks in the snow where the SUV and truck had driven. He said he wasn't sure if the truck, so this would be Julie's brother, right? The truck and the SUV, I guess they're thinking it must be Karen Reed's. Brian Jr. is not sure if the truck was still there when he looked out the window a second time. The defense brought out that in his previous testimony, he said the black SUV had pulled forward. He saw tire marks in the snow on the road. The defense was able to bring out that the visibility was good enough that he could see tire tracks in the snow. And I'm going to note here, he's not seeing tire tracks on the lawn. Also, the defense brought out, he never saw a man in the snow. The witness said he didn't know if Brian Higgins was there when he looked out the second time. He did not know where Brian Higgins was. He said at some point, Brian Higgins was simply not there anymore. And the prosecution objected to this. And so there was a sidebar. He was asked, when did your father leave your view? And the answer was, well, sometime after Brian Higgins left. Well, except he never saw Brian Higgins leave. He doesn't know what time Brian Higgins left. Brian Jr. says he's pretty sure that his father went upstairs. But it comes out he doesn't actually know. He's just assuming. And he's assuming that Brian Higgins must be gone. And the defense points to previous testimony in which he said under oath that he actually has no specific recollection of when Dad went upstairs. But he just figured, well, Dad wouldn't have gone upstairs until his friend left. So the witness is making an assumption, and it's an understandable assumption, and then basing a belief on that and then presenting it as fact. Do you see how easy that happens? On the morning of January 29th, he heard no dog barking, no screaming tires, no screaming people, no vehicles. He doesn't recall if he looked out the window. Turns out he didn't. I mean, if you looked out the window and saw police cars out front of your house, unless that happened all the time, you'd remember that. He was asked how many times that he discussed the case. And he said a lot with his parents, his sister, and with the McCabe's. So they did discuss it a lot. Well, of course they did, though. And if nobody told them or warned them that they should not, of course they would. He mentioned the harassment that his family has faced. And he mentioned that more than once. And I just want to remark on this. That's not cool. It doesn't matter what you think of somebody. It doesn't matter if you think they're evil, horrible people. It doesn't matter. You don't go harassing people. It's just wrong. And in fact, if you harass somebody who is a participant in a criminal proceeding, depending on the jurisdiction, and if that is done in order to impact in any way that proceeding, you can be in trouble for that. All along, he's been presenting pretty well. I think if he's making mistakes, I don't think there's malice here. That's my personal opinion. That's my impression. But then he says something that just screams of coaching. This is what he said. He said, "We have nothing to say. We weren't part of it." Now, doesn't that sound to you like a prepared political statement? Or at least perhaps a parent or someone with more experience saying, look, this is how you deal with this. We have nothing to say. We weren't part of it. And that's that. And the language there, aside from the we, doesn't sound like him. Next up was Caitlin Albert. She lives with her boyfriend of 8 years. She's the oldest of the Albert kids. On January 28th, she and her boyfriend Tristan went to the waterfall at approximately 6 p.m. Tristan knew he'd have to be up early, so he left the waterfall early. She was asked what, if any, entertainment was going on at the waterfall bar. And she thought about it and she said, I think there was maybe a band. The reason I'm pointing this out is because here's an example of somebody using I think, I'm not sure, and she is telling the truth and she is not trying to hedge or hide. There's not one rule that you can apply across the board that's cut and dry, set in stone. It means this or this, black or white. It's not like that. She says she can't be sure of the times of when people came. She said she had met Brian Higgins a couple of times. She said Karen Reed and John O'Keefe came in, but she didn't really have much interaction with them. She didn't really know them. She said it was 12-ish when they left, and the same as everybody else. The mood was good. There was nothing negative going on. She testified she left with her parents, that her father drove, that it was a 5 to 6 minute drive home. She said Dad parked in the driveway and they went in the front door. She said when they went in the front door, they saw Colin. Well, nobody asked her that. She just started giving this narrative about seeing Colin. So again, when somebody introduces something, injects something, it's important. There's a reason why. And there's another issue I have with this. Dad parked in the driveway. They go in the front door. Brian Higgins comes in after her. She doesn't know what Brian Higgins was driving or where he parked. Well, hold on. If she is in the car with her father, who testified very specifically, Brian Higgins was driving a white Jeep Wrangler, very specific about the color and the kind of vehicle, and that Brian Higgins was in the driveway, and Nicole testified to this too, that he was already in the driveway with his vehicle, and Brian Albert added the bit about, and he had his plow attached to his vehicle, and he scraped off some of the snow off the driveway, snow that hadn't really accumulated yet, but okay. And Brian Higgins backed out so that Brian Albert could pull in. So this was an odd little narrative there from Brian Albert. Well, Caitlin's saying she was in the vehicle with mom and dad. If she was in the vehicle with mom and dad, would she have not remembered that they had to wait to get in the driveway? That they jockeyed cars? That there was a snowplow? Like a vehicle with a snowplow in the driveway? That he plowed their driveway? It's off. And it's inconsistent with the testimony of both Nicole and Brian Albert. She says Colin remained in the home only a few minutes, but turns out she doesn't really know. She's assuming. She said the McCabe's were all hanging out in the kitchen and dining room area. She said she stayed in the kitchen dining room area. Her mother brought out speakers. And, nobody asked this either. She was asked, where were you in the house? Not what were you doing? What was your mother doing? Nothing like that. Where were you? Oh, mom brought out speakers. So this is telling me that this issue of the speakers being brought out or music being on is really important to these witnesses. I can't tell you what's in their head. I can't tell you why. I mean, I could think of some theories, as could you, but it's clearly important to them. She said they played music, they had drinks. She said dad went upstairs to let the dog out. And then she said either mom or dad, she can't remember which, was off showing pictures to Brian Higgins. And she mentions volunteers, but the door was open. So this is really important for them to say these two things because they're volunteering this. This is part of a narrative. And the two things are that Brian Higgins and somebody was away from the group because either mom or dad, and other testimony is that it was Brian Albert, is showing Brian pictures. So, if any other witness says, yeah, Brian Higgins and Brian Albert disappeared for a while, well, they have a built-in excuse here. And the mention of the door being open, or the door, there's just a doorway so you could see into the other room. And again, she volunteered that information. Look, when you're having a house party with your family and everything is fine, I mean, nobody's sick, everything's good, you're not monitoring every second of where everybody is, right? So it's unreasonable to think that they would as well, unless there was some reason to do so. So this volunteering this over and over is a flag. Why do you suppose it's so important for them to say this? Caitlin said she left the residence last. She's not sure the order in which other people left. She said Brian's two friends, Sarah and Julie, left at the same time with the McCabe's, all in one vehicle. She said she didn't see or hear anything outside. She said Jen had a cell phone and was on the phone at some point, and she was asked whether or not Jen had charged her phone or if she noticed a phone charger anywhere. So I'm guessing an issue about Jen's cell phone being charged or not charged is somehow going to come up. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to ask. And the witness says she does not recall seeing a phone charger around. She said Tristan, her boyfriend, picked her up. He was driving her vehicle, which is a white Jeep Cherokee. White Jeep Cherokee. And Brian Higgins' vehicle is a white Jeep Wrangler. I'm just throwing that out there. Not saying anything about it, but that's a thing that's got my attention. So just stick a pin in it, because you never know. She said it was snowing a lot at 2 a.m. She said her boyfriend parked in the driveway. Really? Remember at the beginning of this trial, they showed photos and we saw a dash cam video. There were 3 cars in the driveway that morning. She said they left, they backed out of the driveway, they drove in the direction toward where the flagpole is. His wipers were on, he was driving cautiously, and I think the point for the prosecution here is they were being careful. So, I mean, they didn't hit anybody. And again, the weather is really bad. But here's the other thing. They're also not speeding by so that they don't see anything. And she says her attention was on her boyfriend. On cross-examination, Yannetti asked, the next morning you received a call or text from any investigator? No. What about the entire month of February? No. Were you interviewed by any investigator at any point the entire year of 2022? No. In 2023, still no interview. This witness was called to testify at the other grand jury hearing that they keep referring to in 2023, in May of 2023, and still had not been interviewed by any investigator. It wasn't until after that even, until August of 2023, that Proctor interviewed this witness. Wow. John O'Keefe was betrayed. I don't think I've seen where a cop is killed on or off duty and they don't pull out every single resource that they have, that they don't go after it like a pack of bulldogs. We've had things here, cases to which I've been connected at work, and when something happens to a cop, not only do you pull out all the stops, but the supervisors get involved and tell you, you make sure that everything is done by the book. You are meticulous. Your reports will be perfect. You dot your I's and cross your T's, and if you're in doubt as to say whether you need a warrant, you get the paper. You follow the law and do everything to the absolute highest standard because you don't want anything thrown out of court, because you want to catch and convict who did it, and you want an airtight case. And in the case of John O'Keefe, what I'm seeing is the exact opposite. And you know what? It's kind of disgusting. And there are some people who yammer on who are anti-police. Oh yeah, they all stick together. Well, you know what? Who's sticking with John O'Keefe here? Where are his brothers here? They betrayed him. All right, I'll get on with it. It makes me mad. He deserved more than this. Any victim deserves more than this. Caitlin Albert categorizes Brian Higgins as a friend of her father, so she doesn't even call him an acquaintance. And I kind of get that. Yannetti asked, have you watched any testimony? The answer was no. Did anyone tell you about testimony? The answer was no. And while they were talking about this whole thing about Brian Higgins being a friend of her father's and not really an acquaintance, Yannetti goes in for, okay, well, how would you define an acquaintance? And how would you define a friend? That sort of thing. Because he's setting up for the next, which is this. Who is Katie McLaughlin? The answer is they have mutual friends, and she launched into this explanation, like this narrative that wasn't really asked for. So you know darn well that at the very least, even if she didn't hear about other testimony, she knows the gist of it. She knows there's an issue. Now, in all fairness, there's apparently tons of social media chatter, and there would be chatter in the community. The defense asks, is Katie McLaughlin a friend of yours? The answer? Not a close personal friend. Here we go. And the defense said, that's not what I asked you. Would you consider her a friend? And the prosecution objects, and the judge calls a sidebar. When they come back, Yannetti asks, do you know Courtney Proctor? Caitlin says, I know of Courtney Proctor. She's been in her company, and she knows her kids. She was asked, did Trooper Proctor asked how well Caitlin knew his sister, and the answer was no. Yannetti pointed out that, hey, you knew there was a storm coming, right? And she says, yes. And he goes through this whole thing. This was your family home. You're comfortable there. There's lots of room there. Basically, if you wanted to stay the night, you could have. And your boyfriend is going to have to drive in a snowstorm to pick you up when really he needs to be home sleeping because he has to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning to possibly go plow roads. So they went through all this, and basically he's saying she could have stayed the night and it would have made more sense for her to stay the night, yet she didn't. And it begs the question of why is that? He asked if Colin was welcome there, and yes. She said she saw Colin. She said she went to the kitchen where everyone was except for Colin. So no one actually knew where Colin was. She said in the dining room, she couldn't see the basement door from where she was situated. She said she didn't actually see where Colin went, and she never actually saw him leave. And at this point, the defense suggested this would be a good place to break. It was getting later. And I mean, you can't help but laugh because you know the judge is going to interrupt him at some critical point to call for a break or call for the end of the day. This has been the pattern. So at least this time he got to pick his point. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go into the cross-examination. So it's all in one video, but this cross-exam actually takes place May 14th. So Caitlin has had overnight to have a break. The defense points out, I asked you yesterday, who is Katie McLaughlin? And you didn't say firefighter, you didn't say friend, you referenced high school. The witness agreed. They hung out in the same group after high school. Their contact was consistent over the years, and the witness tries to sort of qualify that or play it down a little bit, and she says, yes, but few and far between. And she kept describing it as a mutual friend group. The defense asked her about 8 months prior to the incident that they were at a baby shower together. And I gotta say, the witness was answering, yes, we were. Yes, there was a mutual friend group. Yes, there were social events. And she wasn't obviously hiding or arguing. And that makes her come across better. And the other thing too, for those interested in witnesses and testimony and that sort of thing, right here, it's not actually her that Yannetti is really going after. He's actually going after McLaughlin. And sometimes that happens where a lawyer is going after something from a witness and the witness feels defensive or the witness gets nervous because they feel like the lawyer is going after them when that's not the case. So if you're ever on the stand and you're feeling like that and your brain scrambles saying, what is he after, right? Just tell the truth because you don't know, or you might think you know what the lawyer is doing, and trying to figure that out is a fool's game. Just tell the truth. She agreed that they had gone on road trips, McLaughlin and her. So road trips that included McLaughlin. They'd gone to Maine in 2016 and they actually spent the weekend there. And when the defense was bringing this out, of course, the prosecution is object. And he was objecting so much that Yannetti couldn't ask a flipping question. And it got so bad that Yannetti asked for a sidebar. So Katie McLaughlin and Caitlin Albert did spend a couple of days in Maine together. She doesn't know how many times they'd gone to a beach together. He shows her a beach photo. She says it's a beach somewhere in the Cape. And as this goes on, the witness starts getting really defensive. And she keeps throwing in with other mutual friends. He asked about her college roommates. He can't get an answer because the prosecution is object. Every attempt. Even on things that are probably just going to get overruled, is just object. Finally, again, Yannetti has to approach the judge. Yannetti shows the witness a photo of college roommates and Katie McLaughlin in Caitlin Albert's kitchen in college. The witness says, well, yeah, my roommates invited her over. He asked if they were on a team together through school, like a track team. She doesn't remember. I thought that was weird. He presented her with something to refresh her memory, and then she says, yes, they were teammates. She agrees, finally, that her relationship with Katie McLaughlin continued right up to 2021. The witness says, again, she knew Brian Higgins as a friend of her father's. She said Brian Higgins arrived after she did. If she was in the vehicle with Brian Albert and Nicole Albert arriving home, how does Brian Higgins arrive after her if he's plowing out the driveway with his white Jeep Wrangler with the plow attached to it and has to back out, and the big song and dance from Brian Albert about Brian Higgins and his Jeep and how he got there first? How is that happening? Caitlin Albert says she did not see Brian Higgins arrive in the vehicle. She didn't see what vehicle he drove. She didn't see him park. So she impeached her father without even knowing it. She was asked if Brian Higgins and Brian Albert went off out of her field of vision, and she says no. She says the whole hour and a half that she was there, Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were never out of her field of vision. Wait a minute. In one story, Brian Albert took Brian Higgins upstairs to his son's room to show him pictures. In another story, Brian Albert took Brian Higgins to the family room to show him pictures. But that's okay because, there's a doorway so you can see. So this business of Brian Higgins and Brian Albert going somewhere and the story about looking at pictures is a story to explain should they need it. Remember, Brian Albert and Brian Higgins have policing experience. They know how to do this. So the defense pointed out that Caitlin's boyfriend, Tristan, had to get up at 3 a.m. to go plow, which is why he didn't drink much and why he left earlier. And Caitlin knew he had to be home to catch some sleep. And so the defense posited that the original plan was that Tristan was going to go home and go to sleep and you were going to stay at your parents' house. Right? And she disagreed with that. And so he's challenging her. Hang on. So you're telling me the plan was for Tristan to drive back and forth in a snowstorm in the middle of the night when you know he needs to get his sleep, driving back and forth to Easton to pick her up? And she says, yep, that was the plan. And then he points out, this is the first time you've ever said this, right? And she says, yes, this is the first time she's ever said this. And this drive, according to Caitlin, is 19 minutes drive, assuming there's no snowstorm. And the defense said at 1:45 a.m., it was important for you to leave, right? And she says, well, I wouldn't say it was important. Well, if it wasn't important, you're making your boyfriend drive out in a snowstorm. The defense asked, did you bring Chloe home with you? She says no. Well, that's an interesting little twist. I wonder if we're going to hear more about that. She says she never saw anyone pull up outside the Fairview home. She didn't hear anything. She never heard tires squealing. She never heard anyone yelling. She never saw any vehicle backup lights. Like there was nothing unusual. She says she left via the front door. But she'd been describing that it was slippery out and there are stairs coming down from that front door. So why, if she's concerned about falling and it's slippery and it's cold and that door is further away from the driveway where she says her boyfriend is parked, why does she go out that door? Why not go out the door closest to wherever he's parked? The defense didn't ask that, but I'm wondering. And I'm noticing too that even though normally, according to Nicole Albert, people just use the side door more because it is closer to the driveway, because it is easier. And she would have preferred that people use the front door, but they just ended up using the side door all the time. So that's the norm. So all of a sudden now the norm changes on this particular night. Now everybody's in and out of the front door. And I'm kind of wondering why that is. What is that about? The defense asks her, you're coming out the front door, and against the white snow outside, did you see a black baseball cap? No. A black sneaker? No. A 6'2" man sprawled out on the lawn? No. Taillight pieces? No. Of course not. He asks her, where in the driveway did Tristan park? And she guesses the left lane, so closest to that front door, or to those two doors, I guess. So in the left lane. And she says, but she's not sure. And I will call your attention once again to recall back to the photos at the scene. And there are 3 vehicles in the driveway, and 2 of the vehicles are parked on the left. She says Tristan backed out of the driveway. She's in the passenger side. And the suggestion is that to drive away, the Jeep, Caitlin's Jeep now, would have had to have driven right by where John O'Keefe would have been laying on the ground. And, of course, she didn't see a 6-foot man laying on the ground. So this is interesting. Since there's so much talk of cover-up and relationships, and it's obvious some people are giving testimony that's less than accurate, let's talk for a minute about that. In light of this testimony, I'm going to present a hypothetical that some might have considered. Then I'm going to present a different hypothetical, one that requires fewer people to be involved in a cover-up and would be harder to break. If the theory is that Brian Albert and Brian Higgins put John O'Keefe out there and Brian Higgins had already left, then they would have had to have put him out there before Caitlin left. If that's the theory, that means Caitlin knew he was out there and Caitlin was getting out of Dodge. But I don't think Caitlin knew. Every cop and every lawyer knows that the more people who know about a crime, the higher the chance of being caught. And most fathers would not want their daughters involved in something like this. So I don't think Caitlin saw anything out there. I think there was a problem, and John O'Keefe got seriously injured either outside in the driveway and was taken inside, or in the basement. In the same way, you can take a body out through that bulkhead door, you can take someone in. I think the 2 Bryans got there first, and the 2 other witnesses saying otherwise have been manipulated, overtly or covertly. A police detective knows exactly how to taint a witness, how to impact memory, even without being explicit. If you'll recall, Jen McCabe was standing in the parking lot of the waterfall after John and Karen walked away. John and Karen would have beat Jen McCabe to Fairview. John and the 2 Bryans would have been alone at the house. When the witnesses refer to the Bryans arriving, they are referring to when they first saw them inside the house. If John was unconscious or worse, he would fit easily in that stairwell behind that door that nobody used. So even if somebody did go into the basement, they wouldn't have seen him. I wonder if when Chloe was taken out back, she would have alerted on that door. I wonder if she could have got down those stairs from the backyard if that door wasn't secure. During the festivities, when everybody was there, the 2 Bryans would not need to disappear together for very long, just long enough to talk about what the heck they're going to do. About the same amount of time they'd need to, say, go look at pictures. They'd have to do something with John pretty quickly. If they put him outside near the road where there's no sidewalk and there's a bit of a curve, maybe somebody would find him and think he got hit by a car. But they can't risk doing that with so many people around. They had to wait for people to leave, and Brian Albert would have to get his daughter out of there. Maybe he told her to scram, or maybe there was some other way of hinting to her that she ought to go. In any case, she ends up calling for a ride. Oh, but Brian Higgins had already left, you say? Yes, Exactly. Brian Higgins did leave. Let me ask you this. What is an example of a great alibi? How about being seen inside a police station? Brian Higgins showed up at the police station at around 1:30 a.m. for no reason obvious to anyone else at the time. When I first heard that, I wondered if he wanted to be seen. I might have even said it in a previous video. So by being there and being seen there, he sets up his alibi. Everybody assumes that when a party has left the premises, that's it, that's the end of it, as if nobody ever comes back. Absolutely everybody, including the cameras at the police station, will show that Brian Higgins is there at the police station at 1:30 a.m., not out committing a crime. And those two calls between the two Brians at 2:22 a.m., remember, they're cops. They know not to call and have a big long conversation. Those calls at 2:22 a.m., well, that's after everyone is gone and Brian Jr. is tucked away in bed in La La Land. So Brian Albert can ring Higgins, not even have a conversation, and that's the signal that the coast is clear. And that's when Higgins comes back to Fairview and they move John out of that stairwell. Through that bulkhead door, they toss the broken glass into the snow and dump John on top. That would explain the glass underneath him instead of it flying out of his hands as it would have done had he been hit by a vehicle. And maybe the thinking was that people would assume that he was some drunk guy walking down the street and got hit. And this would also explain the bloodstain patterns. 2 different types of bloodstain pattern on the top layers of snow that had not yet fallen when Karen Reed dropped John off. And the white Jeep Wrangler with the plow on it, you know, the plow that Brian Albert made sure everyone would remember because there was that big song and dance about Higgins plowing the driveway, again when there was nothing really to plow, and the two of them having to jockey vehicles. Well, I bet you that either the plow was never on that Jeep or that Higgins removed it before going back. You see, Caitlin's vehicle was a white Jeep. Any potential witness noticing a vehicle might notice a white Jeep. But on a snowy night, when they don't know they'll be needing to pay attention or remember anything, they won't realize that they ought to observe whether it's a Wrangler or a Cherokee. And if there was some unexpected witness, like cops know happens a lot, who saw a Jeep, they could say, well, if the Jeep did not have a plow on it, then it must have been Caitlin's, not Brian Higgins. And this is why it is so important to Brian Albert for everybody to believe that Caitlin was the last to leave. And if Jen McCabe or anybody else at the scene suggested to Karen Reed, gee, maybe he got hit by a plow or a car, a distraught and traumatized Reed would suddenly worry if she could have done it. That is a common reaction in trauma situations. What if? That's what the trauma victim goes through. What if? And she says to McCabe, could I have hit him? She's a bit hysterical. Oh my God, I hit him. Well, isn't that perfect for the two Brians? Nobody will be looking for a mystery car or a plow because Karen Reed just confessed. In this scenario, nobody has to know all the details, and people can be manipulated into playing along in smaller areas without realizing what they're truly playing along with. And it doesn't require tons of people to be fully involved in some huge conspiracy. It just requires people one at a time to bend or break some rules for a friend. Let me be clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. It's hypothetical. As for Colin, I have thoughts about how he fits in, but I don't have a clear picture yet. There are pieces missing, and there is more to his story that I don't know about yet, and I might not find out. Okay, back to this cross-examination. On redirect, it was brought out that she did meet Courtney Proctor's kids because Julie Albert was babysitting, and basically she just saw them in the back of Julie Albert's vehicle. She'd never met Trooper Proctor before. She says on the track team that she was on with Katie McLaughlin, well, there are about 30 people on that team. Brian Higgins and Brian Albert were out of the room only a few minutes, as far as she can remember. And I'm going to mention something about this. I've seen a good number of cases in which a crime has taken place in a house full of people, one room over, and nobody saw or heard anything, and nobody noticed, and nobody could pinpoint a time at which the accused and the victim were missing. So this happens all the time when you're at a house party, especially if it's your own house and everybody in the house is close to you. You're not monitoring every step that everybody else takes. You're just enjoying the time there. So the fact that they weren't gone as far as she can recall doesn't mean that they weren't gone. The prosecution asked her, so when you were leaving, you never looked over at the unlit area of the lawn. And this was a tactic, and he knows better. He shouldn't have said that because it's him telling the jury, hey, that area is unlit. So she says, no, she wasn't paying attention. And she said she was paying attention to her boyfriend, not the lawn. The defense got up to ask some follow-up questions. He wanted to clarify when it was that Caitlin Albert met Courtney Proctor's children and saw them in the back of Julie Albert's vehicle. And the answer? 2 or 3 years ago. And that's 2 or 3 years ago from now. And so the defense clarified. So that would have been May of 2022 or May of 2021. Yes? Yes. May of 2022 is the same time as that there's an ongoing investigation. And it's also after the time that Julie Albert testified to being the last time that she watched the kids. She said she watched the kids until COVID came. Well, that was prior to 2021. I'm going to leave it here and carry on with May 14th's testimony in a separate video. That's all I've got for you for the moment. Trust your gut. See you in the comments.